So we good to go?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so we were talking about the reasons why we set up this analyst observatory, and in particular, I was introducing myself as somebody who's not an analyst nor an AR pro, but I study these people. And what we've tried to do in the observatory is try and explain this expertise to the outside world, particular colleagues, academics, for example, who study IT markets and digital economy, etc. And the analyst profession is almost invisible to academics. They don't know what it is, what they do, or why they're important. And the AR pro as well is not in that kind of landscape. So what we do in the observatory is we do research, and quite detailed research into what these people's practices are. So what do they actually do when they go out and talk to vendors, and how do they produce the research, and go into the detail. And some of that research is, we published a book several years ago now, where we kind of recounted how the analyst job emerged, and how they became an expert, and how they could command quite significant fees from clients, and basically why they became important for consumers of buyers of technology. We went back and interviewed people like Gideon Gartner about his ideas, why he set the firm up. And we looked at Gartner as a disruptor, so somebody who brought in a new model of doing the analyst role. And often what was interesting about Gideon was they set out to shift how analysts produce their research. So he had these kind of very interesting terms when we talked to him. He wanted to move the analyst from producing kind of heads down research, so where the reader had to study almost like like an article, a text, to produce research which was immediately applicable, so they could get at a glance what the market was, who was the key players, and that was really kind of interesting kind of shift. So we talked to Gideon Gartner, and we studied in detail things like the Magic Quadrant and various other kinds of important rankings. And we also have this project called the Second Most Important Pitch. And so one of the things we noticed several years ago was that up until say 8 or 9 years ago, firms like Gartner would mostly focus on the big tech firms, but then there was a kind of gradual kind of shift where they began to pay more attention to the startups. So and Gartner's had its cool vendor designation for a while now, but then we began to notice other firms, analyst firms, begin to produce similar kinds of designations, where this interest in startups was beginning to grow. And so that was a kind of interesting shift in who the analyst was looking at and the kinds of people they were talking to. And the research we're currently working on is to do with the Gartner hype cycle. So Duncan, Chappell, and I have been interviewing. We interviewed Jackie Fenn, the hype cycle creator, a couple of times, and also we interviewed the analysts who plot. Ask them, well, how do you know when something has moved in the hype cycle? How do you know when it's become, it's maturing? How do you know when it's been overhyped? And so, what kind of criteria do you use, and how do you collect evidence for that? And so, it's interesting when talking to Jackie Fenn, because the hype cycle is not a static bit of research, because Gartner itself has changed how they use it over the 20 or so years since it came out. And so when Jackie Fenn initially produced it, what she wanted to do was scare people, in a sense, to tell buyers, take a step back, don't just rush in. And what they realized over time, as the readers of that research began to respond to them, they realized they could shift people from being scared of hype or new emerging technologies, but actually learn to live and manage hype. So they could actually, be more sophisticated about how they approach overhyped technology. So that was a kind of an interesting shift in how it's used. But what I want to talk about specifically today is the research we did on the categories that the analysts launch, and what I'll do is talk about some of the kind of the details of. We interviewed lots of analysts about, asking them things like, what makes you start a new category? What is it that kind of prompts you to do that? Or, to rename a category, or even to kind of kill one off as well. And that was what we went and interviewed as many analysts as we could and asked them that kind of question. And again, we wrote the paper. The paper was written for mainly an academic kind of audience. And it was interesting because if you look at kind of the the use of, or how someone like Gartner would create categories. There's a kind of interesting pattern to the way they do things. And so, for example, you go back to the late 90s when they launched ERP, so Enterprise Resource Planning Systems. That was a category which kind of shaped the market, and everybody then had to kind of orientate around that category. So ERP became the category which shaped the market's direction. So quite an impactful kind of category. But then, so they launched this category. Then 2 years later, after that category was launched, they said ERP is dead. So the ERP category is now dead. And instead, there's ERP2, right? And then after they launched the ERP2 category, just a few months later, they withdrew the ERP2 category and said that's dead. Okay. If you go forward in time, so to the kind of the mid 2000s, so this is the space or the time when Facebook and LinkedIn are beginning to launch and get more traction. And Gartner was kind of slow to that space, but they eventually released the term or the category social software. So that was how they were going to define that. And then when Facebook came out with its Facebook at Work, they introduced several more categories, including externally facing social software. But then a few months later, they withdrew that category. Okay, so the category was kind of killed off. And so, so from the outside perspective, right? So as an academic or people who are not in this kind of game, no one has got a clue what's going on. So why would Gartner be introducing new categories, segmenting them, changing the names, and then killing them off within the space of a few months? And so it's not clear to people what's kind of going on. And so, and what we found in our research is this kind of pattern, or if you think of the lifespan of a category, how long it lasts for, it's short, and it's getting shorter all the time. So if you look back in time, okay, so from the 80s, 90s, the length or the lifespan of a category is actually quite short. And so some colleagues, Ponticus and Kim, they actually tracked Gartner categories, and apart from a few exceptions, most categories now last around about a year before they're kind of killed off. So it's kind of interesting to have that kind of oversight about the life of a category. Now, and so this can be really confusing. This is confusing for people like academics when they look at this and try to work out what's going on. And so there's a number of ways they try and understand. So what is Gartner and IDC and Forrester, what are they doing with these categories? And so there's a very kind of like almost, let's call it the naive technical view. Some people say it's got to do with the fact that the digital economy is actually very fast moving. This is innovation. It's a really hot space. And so these categories just reflect that. So it's reflecting the pace of innovation, which is very quick moving. So I would say that's a fairly naive technical view of what's going on, that the categories are trying to capture this change in innovation. And there's another kind of two concepts that academics use. One is fads and fashions, and the other is organizing visions. And so fad and fashion, we had an interesting speaker just in this room last week talking about knowledge management. Remember that term? So that would be a good example of a fashion. He was talking about, so the launch of knowledge management, how it, it's pushed by consultants, it captures everyone's attention, you have experts doing knowledge management, but of course it faded away. And so it lasted around about 10 years or so, and it faded away. So that's how people try and understand, these categories that Gartner produce. But actually, it doesn't really capture. The idea of a kind of fad and fashion is a very kind of broad idea, and so it doesn't really explain why someone like Gartner would, in a sense, create this fast-changing category system. And they seem to find, advantages from doing it. So these kind of broad concepts don't really explain, why would they try and create a fast-changing category system? What are they trying to do here? And so this is what the paper wanted to do, try and find a way of explaining that. And well, as you know, in this room, I don't need to tell you this, but so the categories are important because immediately they affect how buyers, how they search and think about the world. So they will consume things through a category. So if you're looking for think of the CRM category or even the ERP category, this defines how they will do search. So, and because the buyer orientates around the category, the vendors then have to themselves align with these categories as well. And so we had lots of examples when, looking at vendors who fail to follow closely the categories of analysts actually being sifted out of procurement contests, or getting negative feedback from people like Gartner saying their products don't really fit the space. And so the category is important basically because it channels buyer behavior, and therefore vendors have to orientate towards what those categories are. And so what we did, we looked at the big three, so IDC, Gartner, and Forrester, and we interviewed analysts over quite a long period of time, so we could see some of their initial categories being created, and then we could see what happened to them afterwards. So we could actually follow them over several years. And then we also interviewed to understand what impact these categories would have on people like vendors. We interviewed AR people about, well, what do you do when your category is killed off with your vendors? Why is that important to you? What happens after your category is killed off? And we asked them simple questions. Just, well, you've created a category. How did you do it? How did you know when to do it? Why did you segment it? And and did you when you killed it off, why did you kill it off? So we asked them fairly kind of practical questions like that. And the paper, we decided to divide it into kind of three processes that we call category work. So what is it the category is doing? So what are they trying to do? We have this other category figuring work. So what we wanted to do was pick up on how these categories often get become identified with the visual things like the Magic Quadrant or the Forrester Wave or the IDC MarketScape. And the third thing, which is, I guess, the client mapping point, is what we wanted to argue, what the evidence kind of suggests is that one of the key things, I guess, determining how they work with categories is it useful for their client? So that's a kind of key drivers about when and why they will change categories. Does it make sense to their clients? We wanted to kind of capture that the importance of a client within that process. So just to give you a flavor of some of the interview excerpts and what these people said to us. So basically, it'd be interesting to see, you will have insight into this. So why did they launch a new category? And so people talked about, or the analysts talked about, the fact they wanted to name something which is emerging, and they wanted to often to be the first one to do that. So internally, there's often pressure amongst analysts to be, to come up with a new name and to be known for a particular area. So that could be your space you're looking at. So there was a kind of rush, to put a stake in the sand, to use the example quoted here. But also, of course, they wanted to, once they name something, it creates a market because they draw a boundary around it, and others begin to orientate around it. So giving a name to a new emerging market was very important. And what's kind of interesting, once they do that, is what happens, what the vendors do, and all of them said this: once you launch a new category, the phone doesn't stop ringing. So it creates a kind of swarm effect. People want to be in that category, so they're inundated with vendors saying, "I like your category. It kind of fits what we're doing. We're definitely in that category." And that kind of thing. So it has this kind of interesting. The launch of a new category has this interesting effect on the market because vendors begin to orientate around the new category. Also, the category is doing two kind of contrasting things. They want to group vendors in the category, so try and find similar things amongst different vendors. So why is this group all kind of similar? What do they do that's common between them? But also they want to kind of differentiate the vendors as well. So we'll get on to talk about the rankings, the Magic Quadrant. It's also important to say, here's a group of vendors. They're all doing similar things, but here's why they're different, okay? And particularly in terms of status, here's why one's better than another. So they want to form some kind of ranking around the category. And oops. Okay, so all right, I see. There were some animations here which aren't working, so let me just move that to the side. So for now, it's interesting because the rankings, the visual rankings are really important. So all rankings like a Magic Quadrant have a category, but not all categories have rankings attached to them. Some don't. In fact, quite a few don't have actual rankings attached to them. but it's kind of interesting. So, and these rankings you'll recognise is, but there's kind of an interesting dynamic around, if you create a category and there is a magic quadrant, how the magic quadrant itself begins to dictate how you act with that category. And so people would say things like, like in a new market, so you've launched a new category, and what you get is this kind of swarming of vendors into the category. And it could be like in some popular categories, 200 vendors. But of course, you can't put 200 vendors on a magic quadrant, okay? Because, well, why not? Well, it's not practical because nobody could read it, the interviewees began to talk in these terms, and they talked about the fact that magic quadrants can be cluttered, and the client can't make sense of it if there's too many vendors on it. And so what they want to do is to try and to present kind of interesting and readable pictures to their clients. And it kind of goes back to when we interviewed Gideon Gartner. Gideon Gartner has a kind of interesting phrase. So when he disrupted the market, what he said is that he wanted to move people from this kind of heads down research, I've got to study this stuff, to research which I could understand in the time while I was having a pee. Okay, that was his kind of phrase. So while I'm having a pee, I should be able to understand what the market is, who the players are in that 10-second period. So the kind of visibility and the easily translatability of the research is really important. So if I just shift on to here, and so from the interviews, and I don't know if this is kind of common knowledge among AR people, but they have these kind of terms they use for the rankings. And so the Gartner analysts will talk about the beautiful picture. Okay, so a beautiful picture is where you have somewhere between 15 to 25 dots, and they're all kind of spaced out in each of the categories. And that's because it's a beautiful picture because it gives the client some choice. Okay, so they can work out, okay, here's the vendors, something like 15, 25, and here's some good ones, here's some not so good ones, and here's some really bad ones, or not so good ones. And why 15 to 25? Well, that gives them a choice. It can't be 50. That's too much choice. That would be confusing. That's heads down research. Again, now I've got to study, but 15 to 25, maybe I've got enough there to do my shortlist. And it was interesting that the other analyst firms had the same kind of idea, that the good market with IDC is 10 to 15 dots, and with the Forrester Wave, they try and create this kind of rugby ball or torpedo shape kind of interest. And that for them is a good market where they get a spread of players with all, like a range of different capacities. Oops, and some of these, my animations don't work. So
well, here you're not in presentation mode. That's
when it's in presentation mode, it doesn't. The slides don't move.
Okay, so I can move these things around. So here's here's an example of this is not a beautiful picture. This magic quadrant here, okay, because there's only five or 4 or 5 vendors on that, right? And they're more or less all in the same category. They're all leaders. So what kind of choice is that for the client? And there's actually not much to really look at. So that's not a beautiful picture. And this one here as well, that's not really beautiful because that's quite confusing. I can't understand. If I'm not having a pee, okay, I can't understand that. I've got to kind of sit down. So I was looking back over time for really cluttered magic quadrants, and when I was doing this research maybe 8 years ago, I could find lots. I did notice now it's actually quite difficult to find cluttered ones. So this message is kind of getting through Gartner. So this has got something like 30 dots on it. It's kind of hard to work out what's going on. Okay, so now, why is this interesting? Okay, that's not mind that one. So if you have a cluttered magic quadrant, what happens? And this, so several analysts told us this story. If they get more than say 15 vendors in a category, they have to split the category, right? So they create a new category to incorporate the vendors. So going back to what I said at the beginning, so this is not reflective of innovation. So it's not because innovation has changed. It's because they want to give their client a beautiful picture. And so they create a new category because of that. So that's a really significant, it seems to me quite significant. So this is about the appearance of these magic quadrants. This is leading to kind of category changes. And so this is a forester analyst talking about, well, we got too many vendors, so what I'm going to do is split the category in two. And what he's then trying to do is work out, well, how come all the players are fairly similar? How can I create a distinction between players so they'll start going into one or the other of the new categories? And he tries to work out, he's got a forester way for SMEs, and he's got another one for bigger firms. But the problem is that the vendors don't play a game with it. Okay, they all want to be in the original category, Forrester Wave, and they don't want to move into the next one. So he's unsure now whether to kind of carry on to carry on with these two categories or to kill one off. And so again, it's kind of interesting, both the splitting and then the vendor reaction to these different categories and what they decide to do. And all of this, like I said, has got to do. It'd be interesting to see what you think about this. But this is, and I'm not saying this is the only thing they've got in their mind, but what they're trying to do is create this world for their client that is easy to understand. I can work out that the IT market's complex, and I can work out what's going on. They want to make it as simple as possible for them. So, and they say this thing over again. We're not trying to make the vendors happy. Care about the vendors. What they want to do is to make the world simple for their clients, so they will renew their subscription. They'll come back again and keep using their research. And so that's that kind of what's driving them. So keeping the client looking at their research. That's the driving factor about around how they create categories. Okay, this is where the animations would have been good, but don't quite work.
I can switch it on.
No,
switch it on for you.
It's okay. It's okay. Yeah. So when they launched the CRM, they initially after it had a success with ERP, launched one ERP category, and very quickly it decided to, when CRM came around, to launch one category for CRM. And of course, it didn't work. And this analyst here in the box, you can see, is saying, well, people don't really buy CRM in the way they do ERP. They buy different, specific functionality. And so the CRM category and Magic Quadrant wasn't any good. And so they created new categories. And here I was going to get you to guess how many categories they created, right? And so it doesn't work. But they actually went from 1 to 48 overnight. Right, which is it's
a lot of work.
It's a lot, but you can imagine the complexity of the market. Suddenly, you've got one category, now you've got 48, and so and the quote below, where this is another analyst from a smaller firm saying, you can imagine the problems that create for the buyer. Now I was looking at one category, now I've got 48 to look at, right? So you need someone to, well, how do you make sense of something where there's 48 boxes of different kinds of technology? So there's kind of a lot of unhappiness around that, the fact they went from 1 to 48. But they interestingly, they have these kind of internal mechanisms. And again, this could be common knowledge to AR pros, I don't know. But they don't present the client with 48 categories. And so they have what we kind of called these front room categories and back room categories. So they keep some stuff at the back they'll work with. And the front rooms are the ones they decide to where they decide to launch Magic Quadrants and make them very visible to their clients. And the question, well, how do they know which of the ones to launch? Well, they're launching 16. How do they know which ones? Well, it's because it's where their client is really interested. These are the ones they will launch as front room categories, these Magic Quadrants, on the topics they get most asked about. And then they have this other thing, from these kind of front room categories and these back room, they kind of cycle between them. So they'll go from, so sometimes the back room categories can become front rooms, or they can merge categories, or they can kind of kill them off. And so that kind of interesting process where they'll cycle between these things which are very visible to the clients and those things which are kept in their kind of back is kind of also kind of interesting. But I want to talk a bit about, and maybe get your reaction to this idea that, what happens when you kill off a category? What effect does it have for, say, a vendor? So you're in a category and business is good, and suddenly your category is killed off. Okay, so what does it mean? What does it mean? And so, and they talk about, the analysts were quite, like I said before, so they want to make the world simple for their client, and they give lots of examples where they've just killed things off, often accidentally. So this colleague here created workforce optimization, And in doing that, it was a sensible kind of category. He killed off a range of other categories that suddenly could no longer exist. So this kind of killing off was a kind of fairly normal part of the category work. Another example where things get killed off is where you have magic quadrants with, like, 4 or 5 vendors. Okay, that's something which is going to get killed off fairly soon, because what interest here is for the client. Okay, there's only 4 vendors. I mean, it's not hard to make your mind up. So those kind of things also lead to kind of categories being killed off.
It kind of depends if it's the first 4 vendors defining that market, or if it's the last 4 remaining in a dying market.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And this is, again, this is where, whether, I mean, there was a kind of interesting lack of politics around this. People didn't seem to complain too much about all of this. This seemed kind of normal in the analyst world and the AR world. There's kind of, your category is killed off. You just kind of get on with it. Okay, what's the new space look like? But there were people who were kind of more critical. So this analyst here was saying, he worked for a small analyst firm. He was saying, like, the analysts are incentivized to keep changing their categories. They seem to, this is part of their business model. And he's saying things like, once you've named everything, what do you do? Do you have to rename it and so on? And he talked about the example of SOA, who I think was created by a Gartner. And so they launched that category. And within about 6 months, they launched SOA 2.0, right? And he was like, what else going on? Okay, and so and so he was really pissed off about this. And so he started, and this is an example of some of the politics you see. He started a petition. He talked to other firms like Oracle and others, and he wrote a blog post and got a petition going and complained about it visibly in the market space, and created a kind of like a bit of kind of controversy around it. And Gartner withdrew the SOA 2.0 category based on the politics. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about, and just make the point that there's something kind of interesting going on here, that these categories are being launched, and the speed, they're getting faster. Okay, the speed at which they're being launched is getting faster, and you can trace that quite easily by tracing magic quadrants and how long they last for. And it's not to do with the intensity of innovation. Often, mostly, it's got to do with this idea that these firms, the analyst firms, are trying to produce a world which is simple for the clients, which is obvious, because they want their client to keep on buying their research, and that has kind of interesting implications, which I think you're better placed than me to talk about. And what does it mean for a vendor? This kind of turnover, and why does it happen? And it could be that if the analyst firms are always trying to satisfy their clients, you're getting competition between the analyst firms, for the attention of audiences. They're competing with each other to have, this attention. And you can see what it means to a vendor. So if you're the category king, and then your category is killed off, that can have, quite significant consequences. So I think that was my last slide. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that happened to us actually. With we were the leader of a category, and it got put into another category that was already existing, that was completely different. So now there's this oversaturated category that people don't really fit into. It's different. So we're creating a new category.
There's some that's really interesting, Neil. I guess viewing it from an analyst perspective. Thank you, Duncan. I hope you can hear me. Viewing from an analyst perspective, I think so much of the process, it would be great if there was a process in the analyst firms, but so much of it is about stirring a pot of pasta. Is it ready? Take one out, throw it against the wall. Does it stick? So there's that. When it comes to true innovation, it would be great to think that clients helped analysts determine new categories, but so much of it is about the raw commerciality of it. So for instance, I've had numerous occasions where let's say a quadrant, it wouldn't necessarily be a magic quadrant, but a graph. You all right?
Yes.
A graph has vendors on it, and make sure that the top paying clients are on that graph. If they're not, they will be pissed and we will have hell to pay. Many of the decisions about subcategories are about, well, who is paying us less than other areas. Now, I've been in a number of situations where, as an internal analyst with a tech vendor, where a decision was made to, let's say, reduce the spend on a particular analyst firm. I won't say who it was. And of course, there was anger and big pushback from the analyst firm. And then, sure enough, the high ranking on the top right suddenly became kind of closer to the bottom left in these particular categories, because it was a cut of about $500,000 to $1 million. These things go on all the time. I think the other part, which kind of explains some of the background, is in many cases, it's not really competition between the analyst firms. This thing about, which analyst firm comes out with the category first or sets the agenda first. So much of it is internal within the analyst firms themselves. Egos get in the way. Who sets the agenda, who controls that agenda, largely then determines a category. And the production of the categorizations is often done by committee or by influence. So you can get voted out, or you can become, let's say, marginalized by a decision. I don't think that should be a surprise to anyone, but I think it's interesting that certainly since the beginning of the pandemic, the life cycle of the categories has increased quite rapidly, and that's because there's a real push for analysts to come up with the new category, the next new category, and it can't stay around for too long because then it becomes stale. Clients want to see what the new things are. You create a new category, there's sudden interest. You create a new category because clients are willing to spend money on that because they have an interest in where they say. So I think that it would be great if the process was like that, but underneath there are the layers of, let's say, ego, control, agenda setting, and then at the base of it, the raw commerciality that drives why analysts firms do what they do.
So I have a question. Have you ever heard of a category being created by influence from outside sources mainly?
No.
I'm running an experiment.
No, well, and here's the interesting thing. If you think about, some categories are kind of word salad, right? You put things together. Like in your case, you talked about the 48 different subcategories of ERP, for instance. And some of that is a true reflection of the fracturing of the market. But so much of it is about trying to keep the clients happy with their competing definitions of the market. A classic one I was involved with was the whole issue of private cloud, public cloud. That became a contentious issue because a couple of key suppliers differed in their definition. And it came down to a kind of which client is the most important to satisfy, therefore we'll change the definition to the one that they pay us more to supply analysis on. And ergo, that became the definition of that category. So a lot of it is very much kind of made up on the spot or directly influenced by external factors about the definition.
So we're running an experiment right now where we've created a category, we've books on it, and now we're maybe having our clients call and ask for it and see if that will do anything. So we've had a couple of analysts pick up on it so far. Smaller firms have started talking about it. So we'll.
What's the category?
Workforce agility.
Okay.
Have you identified sort of worthy rivals that you would include in that
created
category?
a Lumascape that shows the entire category and who fits into the various portions of it.
So typically what you'll find is internally in the analyst firm, when a new category is being created, as I've done myself, there's usually an internal proposal you have to put together, basically a business case. And you define the category, why is it unique? Why is it different from other categories? Is there enough differentiation? Okay, if that's the case, list the clients who would buy this research, list the companies that you put in that research, and then it's kind of debated and discussed backwards and forwards at various management levels, and then you're perhaps given the green light or not. It's quite tough to create new categories on the fly because you have to justify, your spend on it and whatever. I think the flip side to the devolving of the dissolution of categories is then the effect on the analyst firms themselves. So yeah, people can be redeployed. Many people perhaps are laid off, and then others are going after many, many years because that category is seen as strategic for a select number of customers. I was talking with an analyst the other day. She specializes in the print industry. Now, who would have thought after all these years, and she's been doing it since the 1980s, but in amongst the morass of analysis out there, we still have, the Ricos and the Xeroxes and the print-on-demand companies, and that forms that kind of basis. Is it an innovative category? Not really, but it's solid business that keeps going. And so that's another reason that kind of defines, generation or innovation and category definition. So,
I mean, it's an interesting point about the life cycle of the life cycle of categories. That like Gartner, for example, right? Huge analyst firm. Its zoo of categories is very well maintained, and if you don't get visitors coming to the enclosure to take a look at the vendors that you've got inside that category, then it will be closed because it's prime real estate, and they will move in. That they will either move in a new category, or more likely they are really reducing the number of categories. Over the decades, it's fewer than 200 categories, I think now. But then there's a second, third, fourth tier analyst firm that will take that and maintain it as long as there is business in it. And actually, the printer market is, everyone's, I've got a printer, I print things. It's still a big enterprise market, and companies still buy them. But no analyst, like imagine, you're the printer analyst and you're sitting next to the guy who's doing artificial intelligence for fraud prevention in finance. He's getting a lot of calls, feels very glamorous, whereas there you are looking after the printer market.
Yeah, but you're making money doing
You're
that.
making bank. You're making solid
like
bank.
Sitting next to the AI guy, or maybe sitting next to the quantum analyst.
Yeah.
Where's the money in the quantum analyst market? But at the same time, it ticks the boxes for from a marketing perspective, from an innovation perspective, and from a headline grabbing perspective. Whereas you don't, the printer analyst doesn't really get that, but it's solid business. So,
if you think back to your chart where you had like the magic quadrant, the IDC MarketScape, and the Forrester wave, like these diagrams are all quite similar, except that Gartner stretches out the capability axis basically to use the space available, whereas IDC compresses it a little bit more because it doesn't want to embarrass people by putting them down by the origin. And Forrester squeezes it even more, so that they're all basically very, very good winners, right? And I think from a graphic design point of view, I think it's weird to not use the space available. Like the labels are more legible if you have, if you space them all out as much as possible.
There is a reason for that. Sorry to interrupt you, but there's a good reason for that. And again, having sat in on many meetings, either as an analyst within a technology firm, in particular, what happens is if you've got space to provide differentiation, good for the.
Sorry, there's a question. If you could just share that picture of the magic quadrants.
Yeah, no. If you create space, you provide differentiation. That's great for the end user or the procurer because it provides that differentiation. However, if you're producing that graph, suddenly clients can see, oh, why am I there and not there? Why is the scale of this like this and not like that? Why is it one thing I learned very early on about graphs like that is you never have a scale of anywhere on the left, on the X,
5, 6, 7. Yeah.
Because what happens is the discussion suddenly is all about the numbers.
Yeah.
So this thing about, you know, completeness of vision or whatever, it has to be kind of vague and has to be a little bit smoke and mirrors, because that's where the, you know, the analyst magic comes in to provide that definition. But that's the reason why they're compressed. It means you're not really going to piss off too many vendors or your clients by seeing that there's a significant differentiation. Typically, you can say, okay, you are slightly to the left, to the right, and up. But, you know, well, you know, the statistical variation, these figures can, you know, come and go. There's a flux. Maybe next year it'll be slightly there. It keeps everybody kind of comfortable and happy.
There's an interesting point in the chat by Ian who says one issue with cluttered diagrams is that you can end up with the same 10 or so providers every time. By expanding the number to include more niche firms, it allows clients to see what is actually being bought. We, says Ian, track what SOW and contracts are actually being signed and then produce quadrants about those topics, not just trends, but actual spend. And obviously many analysts don't have information about actual spend.
Yes,
together.
And I think that's the hard part. And Ian has got a very good point there, which is these graphs give a kind of an impression, typically, you know, often influenced by other factors that don't necessarily reflect the vendor's real space. But when you then start to get companies who can supply data from surveys and apply it, you sometimes get quite a different picture. To Ian's point, yeah, number of contracts, value of contracts, it will start to change things. And I think when it's applied like that, that has a lot of value. The data behind it is really important.
Well, in the Magic Quadrant, at least when I did my last Magic Quadrants, we had literally 250 questions. Some were verbose, some were data, some were kind of very different formats. So all of this goes into some magic calculations in the background, but then also what factors in is your presentation, the briefing that you're giving, the client references and how they talk about your service and all that. So that's obviously hard then to quantify. So there will be a major part of your positioning of your little blue dot will be down to the analyst's feeling about how you're doing relative to the other vendors that have presented themselves. So, and that's a good thing, I believe, because to some extent, that's why we find them valuable, because they have literally 20, 30 years of experience in a market looking at trends and understanding how things move. And therefore we trust their view of what matters and where there's meat to the bone actually, or where there's actually slideware and these things. So yes, it's not a precise mathematical thing, but particular that thing has value. To the other point of a limited number of companies being reflected in a quadrant, I think that the challenge there with including smaller firms, maybe even more innovative firms, is that it would quickly lead to vendors that have not been included challenging the analysts. Why did you include these firms and not us? We are larger than them. We sell more services, and yet we're not included. And that quickly becomes a really difficult argument. So what the firms are typically doing is that they're setting sort of quantifiable hurdles for inclusion, which does make sense, but which also leads to very innovative small firms not being included. So what they then do is they kind of include them as noteworthy mentions in the write-up without a lot of detail behind it. But that's only, a suboptimal solution to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's good. And that's often where the the analyst firms, account managers, and new business folk come in, because they will then go to these new startups and these innovative firms who are a bit unhappy about not being in there and say, well, maybe you could buy into our services and have have an analyst, give a briefing to an analyst, and this is a good way to get exposure. And that's often a very persuasive way of then becoming a client and paying for the services, and then getting in.
No. I disagree with that. I really disagree with that, because briefings are always free. You don't need to be a client to do a briefing. If you need to pay to do a briefing, run away.
No, not paid to do a briefing, but this is a way to onboard. It's a way to onboard as opposed to be out in the wilderness with everybody else.
Well, I suppose what you really mean is becoming a client in order to have rights to do increase with them.
Yeah,
that's a different thing.
Yeah.
Because through increase, I can get a lot of. I can force the analyst to listen to my thinking without that being, at risk of being disclosed to the public. So I can be much more open to the analyst and talk to him about what I'm thinking about, what I'm considering, what has worked, what hasn't, and pull his information into my product development, my go-to-market, my business development, all of that. And he will not be able to talk about that because it's under NDA, because it's an inquiry and not a briefing.
Yeah.
The trick there, and that obviously brings value into my business, and therefore I need to pay for it.
Yeah.
The trick there being that by doing this a couple of times, more often than I do briefings, I create awareness and understanding and share of mind with that analyst, and maybe that will also through the growth that I'm creating from it may bring me closer to a noteworthy mention or even an inclusion in a quadrant.
Yeah,
but it's not something not that I'm a client that gets me on the MQ. It's my having just more exposure to them through my right of doing increase, where I force them to think with me.
Just a few things I should mention. So, of course, we were supposed to finish this session at 11, but we started late. So, what I should have telepathically communicated was, I'm going to wrap up this conversation at 15:15 when we should be starting Ian's session. Then I think we can take a little comfort break. We can bring Rob in. In fact, let me just unmute myself so that Robin. In fact, Robin, you can maybe even hear me because I'm unmuted. So, Robin, if you can leave the meeting that you're in here and go back to the session that you were in previously with that URL that is on the screen now. You were in that meeting previously. When Martin, who is looking after the tech, sees Robin Shapper come into the room, he will upgrade you to being a speaker. Robin, I don't think you can hear me because you're not reacting in any way. So we'll see what happens. But basically, if we kind of wrap this up in 5 minutes, have a little comfort break, and then start with Ian and Robin's session, I will send an email to Robin to let her know to turn on her speakers or look at the screen, and then we'll see where we are. There are some comments I just wanted to share from the chat, and then I'm going to share those. And then what I might do is kind of give both Ian and Rory 2 or 3 minutes for their final thoughts, and then we'll take a break at 15:15. Yeah. So one comment: eligibility criteria should not be on revenue. We create criteria on capability where there's a difference between where there is a difference between revenue. That is where you create a mid-market or a large market quadrant. This is the same criteria for both quadrants, and then I can differentiate between large and small on the same criteria. I have quadrants, says this analyst, where $20 million providers are beside $1 billion firms. They provide similar capabilities, and the small firms actually relish being a David against the Goliaths.
Yeah.
And then Chris Holscher from the other side of the table replies, these inclusion hurdles, e.g. revenue, global reach, etc., are typically only applied when needed to bring the number of firms down to a consumable level. That might be something that Rory might want to comment on, like how early is a market where you're not using revenue criteria on the marketscape, but come to that later on.
Yeah.
After but yeah, the less you need hurdles, the better. Yeah, Rory, do you want to give like a minute or two each with any, I don't know, thoughts, reactions? You can even take more than a minute. It's your building. You can take as long as you want.
Yeah, no, it's kind of, thanks for those comments about. It's interesting. I mean, our research is only like a fragment of what's going on, because interviewing analysts. It's kind of, so it's interesting to hear that. I mean, if I can make a comment, it's kind of interesting because you talked about the deep commercialism in. I'm not saying your point you were cynical. It was kind of interesting that you're saying they're non-objective is business, whereas actually the AR people were saying, well, actually they are quite objective, because you have to know the game and you can interact with analysts, etc. But there is a kind of process there, so it's almost like a reversal of the. So I was a bit unsure of how that conversation kind of came about, and like so.
Yeah.
So the people doing the categories are kind of quite cynical, but those who are affected by them believe in the process more. And I don't know why that's kind of turned out that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, I am first to put up my hand and say there is a strong blend of cynicism with me. But, I think that's important. It's important to be slightly cynical in the same way as it's important to be slightly paranoid about things, because then people can't get you. It's this idea. The process works when everybody is genuinely interested in what the result will be, which is, analysts working collaboratively in conjunction with the AR people to then produce the kind of outcomes that the client businesses need to happen. It's that lovely flow, and that's great. Unfortunately, especially in many of the mature categories, there are other things going on where you have agenda setting, large amounts of renewals coming in, and it's sustainable business that needs to be repeated each year. Those kind of form the basis. Where the interesting stuff is where you are seeing innovation, to your point, Neil, where you are, like you're working with the Finnish company, new categories, new areas of business that are yet to be defined, where clients really need some help in getting a perspective on what's going on. I've always found those areas to be most interested in working in. I'm sure you as well. And that's where the startups come in. It's where those who are providing a really different or niche or industry perspective on the business that they do. And thankfully, that's becoming more recognized. It is the case that a lot of the established practices and a lot of the established analysis that, Neil, that you've been covering tends to then exhibit that kind of bad behavior, as I put it. But it's there. We just have to realize that a lot of that forms the basis for the money that's going around in the market. And the rest on top, we hope will then replace those bad practices in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing that is underrepresented in the discussion of those things is that to your question, how does it come that there's on one hand a cynical view on the creation of quadrants or all these tools, and on the other hand, the AR people really trust in that. And I think there's a big difference between those tools at firms that have the majority of their business created on the vendor side versus analyst firms that have the majority of their business created on the buyer side. With Gartner, for example, where the business is relatively well balanced, maybe even with a tendency towards the buyer side, they are relatively well protected from the cynical part of what you described, in that, the more you pay as a vendor, the higher up and to the right you might be placed in a product. It just doesn't matter because the business doesn't come from that end of the market to that extent that would make that happen. On the other hand, there's the vast majority of analyst firms who are not in the powerful position of our friends at Gartner. They have the majority of their revenues coming from from the vendor side, and very often also in the form of commissioned research or commissioned case studies and these things. So they very much depend on these business relationships being upheld and positive, and so they are very much at the risk that you're describing. So part of our job as analyst relations professionals is to look at this playing field very closely and understand what motivates the various vendors and what track record they have in terms of honesty and in terms of reliability and trustworthiness of what they produce. And that is not in general, but for different products even. You know, some products from analyst firms that have a lot of revenue created on the vendor side may be highly trustworthy.
Sorry, we really have to wrap up and.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.